Simpson matter. Mr. Simpson is again present before the court with his counsel, Mr. Cochran. I saw Mr. Shapiro earlier today. Mr. Blasier, people represented by Ms. Kahn, Ms. Clark, and Mr. Harmon, also Mr. Darden. Jury is not present. Mr. Blasier, good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. In order to avoid a break between Ms. Clark's cross-examination and my redirect, I'd like to make this motion now. Even though we called Agent Martz as our witness, I think it's apparent that he is not, that he's a hostile witness to the defense. I think that's not only apparent by who he was doing these tests for, but his change in demeanor after yesterday morning's session, as well as his demeanor during Ms. Clark's cross-examination. So I would ask leave of the court under 776 to cross-examine him in place of my redirect examination when she is done.
In other words, you were asking for the ability to ask leading questions?
Yes.
All right. Ms. Clark, any comment?
He was asking leading questions.
You didn't object?
That's right. I didn't. I don't see that there's any big change. I don't think that Agent Martz is going to be a hostile witness. He's been very forthright. Counsel's unhappy with his answers. That doesn't make him hostile. Seriously, you know, I mean, substantively speaking, you may not like the answer. That doesn't make the witness hostile. So I don't know what Mr. Blasier proposes to change, but I would urge the court not to make that finding because I don't think it would be warranted by the evidence or by the witness's testimony thus far.
All right. Thank you, counsel. Anything else, Mr. Blasier?
No, I'll submit.
All right. Your request is granted.
I'm sorry.
Your request is granted. You're welcome. All right. Let's have the jury, please.
Your Honor, an additional matter.
Mr. Darden, good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. We served the defense yesterday with an SDT for a cassette tape provided the defense by Gretchen Stockdale. May I inquire of the defense if they intend to comply with the SDT for the audio tape today?
As I understand, the court granted leave for Mr. Ullman to address all motions tomorrow morning. I think he'll be addressing that at that time, if that's all right, the court.
All right. We'll take it up tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. All right, let's have the jurors, please.
Redo the printouts. The exposure was not good on the first set, and I'd like to be able to use those with the jury in the cross-examination.
How long is this going to take, Mr. Furlong?
Finished.
It doesn't take long to capture, it just takes long to print it out. All right, the record should reflect that we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. All right, Agent Roger Martz, would you resume the witness stand, please? All right, the record will reflect that FBI Special Agent Roger Martz is again on the witness stand undergoing cross-examination by Ms. Clark. Good afternoon, Agent Martz.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Agent Martz, you were reminded, sir, that you were still under oath, and Ms. Clark, you may conclude your direct cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. All right, sir, where we left off, we were talking about the high-pressure liquid chromatography test that you did on the blood samples. You recall that?
Yes, I do.
I believe you indicated that that particular test, the HPLC, was just a screening test that you would not rely on for any conclusion. You recall that testimony?
Yes, that's a screening test, and you would not use that for identification.
For identification?
That is correct, yes.
So there is a difference then between the kind of test that will give you some indication of what might be present versus a test that will give you a definitive answer that something can be identified.
That's correct, yes.
You were present during Dr. Reeder's testimony in court the other day, were you not, sir?
Yes, I was.
And do you recall when I began to question him concerning the work he did in the case that we called the Sconce case, People versus Sconce?
Yes.
And in that case, he was retained to answer the question as to whether or not the victim had been poisoned to death by the use of the oleander plant or died of natural causes. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
This agent has personal knowledge of any of this.
Sustained, but it's a little premature, but I agree with you on a foundational grounds, but it's premature at this point. Proceed.
Now, he testified that he used three tests in analyzing the autopsy tissues of the victim: thin layer chromatography, fluorescence spectrometry, and radioimmunoassay. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And I believe that he testified that those were the best then available methods to test for the presence of oleandrin. Do you recall that testimony, sir?
Yes, I do.
Are you familiar with those tests?
Yes, I am.
Have you performed them ever?
Yes, I have.
Sir, are those tests effective to positively identify a compound?
Well, I won't say absolutely yes or no. It would depend on the compound and the circumstances, and you'd have to review all the data. It's possible that they could under circumstances, but it would depend on the specific chemical trying to identify.
With respect to oleandrin, do you have an opinion as to whether or not those tests would be effective to positively identify that substance?
Objection, no foundation.
Sustained.
Have you ever performed any tests to detect the presence of poison, sir?
Yes, I have.
Have you ever performed any tests to detect the presence of poison such as oleandrin?
Well, every chemical is a little different, but we have identified chemicals that are similar, but not that specific chemical.
Are the same tests, for the purpose of identifying a particular poison and of the family similar to that of oleandrin, do you use the same kind of tests for that family of chemicals, poisons such as oleandrin?
Well, at the FBI laboratory, we primarily rely on mass spectrometry to do our identifications.
And in that regard, sir, do you have an opinion as to whether or not the thin layer chromatography, radioimmunoassay, and fluorescence spectrometry tests are more or less effective than mass spectrometry for the purpose of detection of poisons?
Objection, irrelevant, unless he's talking about oleander.
Overruled.
They could all be used for determining whether or not it could be present, but for the identification, I would rely on the mass spectrometry to identify that chemical.
So for the purpose of identifying poisons, sir, would the tests used by Dr. Reeders be most appropriately characterized as screening tests?
Objection, no foundation.
Sustained. Poison is awfully vague, counsel.
For the compound known as oleandrin, sir, do you have any knowledge of the composition of that compound?
I've looked at the chemical, and it's I know it. Basically, I know what it looks like. I couldn't draw the structure or give you the formula for it.
If you, sir, were asked in the year 1988 to analyze autopsy tissues to determine whether or not you could identify oleandrin in those tissues, would you have used thin layer chromatography, radioimmunoassay, and fluorescence spectrometry?
Objection, calls for speculation.
Overruled.
Irrelevant.
Overruled.
To detect it or identify it?
to identify it?
No, I would use mass spectrometry.
Because,
It's a definitive test.
and the other three that I've outlined are not?
They are not definitive tests in themselves, no.
Was mass spectrometry available back in 1988?
Yes, it was.
As a matter of fact, as of 1988, did the liquid chromatograph tandem mass spectrometer exist?
Yes, it did.
Do you know when it first became available?
Well, there's been many forms of liquid chromatography mass spectrometry. In the FBI, we've used various forms since about 1986.
1986?
Yes,
Now, you yourself at the FBI use a machine known as the liquid chromatograph tandem mass spectrometer, correct?
that's correct.
And if you don't mind, from now on, I'm going to say LC-MS-MS.
Okay.
Okay. Was that particular machine was available as of 1986?
The specific one that I use presently was not, but there were other forms of LC-MS-MS available in 1986. The electrospray was not commercially available, the one that I'm using in 1986.
Nevertheless, there were other forms of the LC-MS-MS that were available in 1986, correct?
Yes, there were.
Overrule, but the answer's already.
Would the LC-MS-MS, as it existed in 1986 through 88, have been a more effective piece of equipment to use for the identification of oleandrin?
Objection, irrelevant.
Foundation. Sustain. Form that was in existence then.
What form of LC-MS-MS was in existence back in 1988?
There were several types. One was a direct liquid injection. They had a moving belt. There were several different types. Probably thermospray was available then. But there are many different forms of LC-MS.
Are you familiar with the manner in which they are operated and the substances that they can most effectively identify?
Yes, I am.
And would the LC-MS-MS, the forms that existed then back in 1988, would one of them or all of them have been a more effective means of identifying oleandrin than the tests used by Dr. Reeders?
Objection, no foundation, he's never tested this.
Overrule.
Yes, the LC-MS would be a more effective way to identify oleandrin.
All right, let's move on.
Now, you talked, sir, just now you mentioned something about detection versus identification. Can you please tell us what you mean when you say something is detected?
Well, detecting is used in a general term in the laboratory. We have certain tests called spot tests. And for something like cocaine, you would do a spot test and you get a color and you could say cocaine was detected. But what you have to realize is there's many other chemicals that would also give similar results. So even though it was detected with that particular test, it doesn't mean it was identified. In order to identify something, you have to use a positive means of identification. And in the FBI laboratory, we use mass spectrometry as a positive way to identify something based on a full mass spectrum.
So when you detect, that means something could be present.
That's correct.
But when you identify, you say it is.
That's correct.
I noticed that when you were being examined by Mr. Blasier, he asked you specifically whether or not on one of the evidence stains there was ions consistent with EDTA. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And do you recall answering the question, yes,
Yes.
consistent with?
Right, correct.
When you say consistent with, do you mean that you have identified the compound, or do you mean that it has been detected? That is, it could be there, but you have not identified it.
When something is consistent with something else, it is not a positive identification. It could be something else. With preliminary tests that you do in the laboratory, there's a lot of chemicals that could be consistent. But in order to identify something, you have to have something unique associated with that chemical before you can positively identify it. And that's what a mass spectrum does. Some people will say that a mass spectrum, a full mass spectrum, is a fingerprint of a chemical. And that's why we try to do a full mass spectrum to identify a chemical.
Now, in that regard, sir, when you discussed this issue with Mr. Blasier in Washington or over the telephone, did you inform him of the distinction between consistent and identified?
Yes, I did.
And in this case, sir, in the evidence stains and in your own blood, I believe you testified earlier you could not find the full daughter spectrum.
That's correct.
And that was the one, you could not find the 132 ion?
The 132, the 160, and the 293 in a certain ratio.
Yeah, I just foundational to the graph, Your Honor. Now, you indicated you tested your own blood on May 11th,
That's correct.
and you did so with and without EDTA.
Yes.
I'd like to show you some graphs, sir. And you generated graphs as a result of those tests,
Yes, I did.
and those graphs were made to depict the results that you obtained.
That's correct.
All right, Your Honor, I have a series of 3 graphs. You marked people's 549, 548. 549. That's what yeah, thank you, Your Honor. 549A will be the chart entitled Operator Blood, No EDTA Added, red top, with a start time of 10 o'clock and 21 seconds. The second one, 549B, Operator Blood with EDTA. The third one, Operator Blood, no EDTA added, time start 10:19:55, be 549C. Putting up on the Elmo, 549A, first of all. Can you see, we could just show him the top label, Mr. Farquhar, so he can make sure that's what.
Yes.
All right. And pushing it over to the left, if you could see the start time, what does that mean?
That's the time that the analysis began, 10 o'clock in the morning.
Now, these printouts all reflect a certain time for starting.
That's correct.
We talked a little bit about the variation in quantification that will occur as a result of the sensitivity of the column. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Is it then important to run all of your samples at the same time?
Yes, it is.
And in that way, will you get an accurate ratio? In other words, they'll all run in the same way, so you'll see them relate to each other in an appropriate, more accurate fashion.
It's best to run the samples very close together in order to get the best quantitation.
And the most accurate ratio between them.
That's correct.
And by ratio, I mean relative peaks. In other words, if one is very high and one is very low, if you run them at the same time, would that relative height and depth be accurate?
Well, it depends on your definition of accurate. It's not going to be 100% accurate, but the closer you can run your samples together, the better off you are.
All right, now, is this the run that you did on May 11th of 1995 on your own blood that you had put into a red top tube that did not contain EDTA?
Yes.
And can you describe for us what is shown in this graph?
This is the reconstructed ion of 160, which is an ion produced from the 293 parent of EDTA.
Now, there is a peak shown there, correct?
Yes, there is.
What does that indicate?
It indicates that EDTA could be present.
Based on this reading, would you identify EDTA as being present?
No, I would not.
Does this bear any similarity, this test run on your own blood without EDTA, does this bear any similarity to the results obtained when the evidence stains were run?
These are very similar results I got to the stain from the sock and from the gate.
Now I'm going to show you, sir. I'm going to show you the next one. I'm going to show you 549C. If you can read that, is that again a test of your own blood with no EDTA added on May 11th?
Yes, it is.
Start time of 10:19 and 55 seconds.
That's correct.
Now, was this also from a red cap tube?
This was a repeat of the other injection. I just repeated the same solution.
And can you describe for us what the result is that's depicted in this graph?
Again, there's indication that EDTA could be present in my blood.
And this is the blood from the tube that does not contain EDTA.
That's correct.
From that result, would you form the opinion that there was EDTA present?
No, I would not. There's not sufficient data to identify EDTA.
And that is because?
This is just a chromatogram with one daughter ion. It's not a full daughter spectrum.
And for the full daughter spectrum to be present that would allow you to identify EDTA, would you have to see the 132 daughter ion?
That's correct.
Now then, did you run your blood with EDTA added?
Yes, I did.
I'm showing you 549B, sir. Is this the graph that depicts the run in which you ran your blood with EDTA added?
Yes, it is.
Can you tell us what the result is shown in this graph?
Again, there's indications that EDTA could be present in this particular blood sample.
Now, does this have a different appearance than, than the evidence stains that you had run?
The peak is larger than the evidence stains.
I don't see any of those jagged random peaks around that one larger peak.
Well, the noise kind of gets buried when you have a large signal.
So does this graph demonstrate that the blood, your blood when having EDTA added, gives a strong signal
That's correct.
on the 160 daughter ion?
Yes.
Then the random peaks that you call noise on the blood sample of your own blood without EDTA, does that indicate that the signal for the 160 daughter ion was weak?
That's correct.
And is that very similar, again, to the evidence stains?
It's very similar to the evidence stains.
Now, on July 22nd, sir, did you do some further testing?
Yes, I did.
And what was that?
I retested my blood, the same blood samples, and got similar results on that day.
Your Honor, I have here additional graphs. With the date July 22nd, 1995, RMM blood, no EDTA. I'd ask that it be marked Peoples 550A.
So marked.
Sir, is RMM on this graph you?
Those are my initials, yes.
And again, July 22nd, 1995, RMM blood with EDTA 550B. And showing you 550A, sir. I'm sorry. Showing you 550A, sir.
Yes.
Is that the graph that depicts the test you did on your own blood with no EDTA added on July 22nd, 1995?
Yes, it is.
Can you tell us what is shown in this graph?
Again, there's indications that EDTA could be present.
And again, does this graph also bear resemblance or similarities to the evidence stains?
Yes, it does.
And in what respect?
It gives a low signal comparison to the known EDTA blood standards.
Compared to the known EDTA?
Yes.
And showing you 550B? Is this the test of your blood, sir, with EDTA added?
Yes, it is.
And based on the results in this graph, would you identify EDTA as being present?
There's indications that EDTA could be present based on the 160 daughter ion.
Now, does this graph, again, demonstrate the same difference that you saw when you ran the known reference samples that you knew to contain EDTA that were taken from the EDTA tube in this case?
Yes, it's very similar results.
In what respect?
It's a very large abundance of the 160 ion.
Now, did you also attempt to conduct a test that would tell you whether or not you could find EDTA after a period of time?
Yes, I did.
And in that respect, what did you do?
Well, I took some old blood samples that we had in the laboratory and analyzed those.
And how old were they?
One of them, I believe, was from 1991, and the other two were from 1993.
Two more charts, Your Honor. Entitled July 22nd, 1995, EDTA blood from 1993, People's...
551.
Thank you. 551A,
Fine. A and B.
and the second one B.
Proceed.
Showing you People's 551A. Is this the graph that depicts your testing of a stain from 1993 that was known to contain EDTA?
Yes, it is.
And what do you see on this graph, sir?
Again, there's a very large abundance of the 160 ion.
And did that bear any similarity to the known reference sample stains that you created in this case taken from the vial of the defendant and Nicole Brown?
Very similar results, yes.
In that,
A very large abundance of the 160 ion.
and 551B, does this graph depict the other test that you ran on 1993 blood known to contain EDTA?
Yes.
Now, based on this finding, the blood from 1993 that was known to contain EDTA, did you form some opinion about how stable the compound is or how long it will last?
This pretty much bared out what I had suspected, that EDTA is a very stable chemical, and I didn't see any degradation of the EDTA over the 2-year time period.
Now, as a general proposition, sir, are the chemicals found in blood more stable when blood is dried or when it is wet?
Most chemicals are much more stable when they're dry than when they're wet.
So, for example, if you have blood that is deposited on a rear gate that dries quickly on that rear gate, will the chemicals in that blood be more stable and more easily detected after a period of time than if the blood was in a wet pool of blood? Sir, are you familiar with the properties of chemicals found in blood and how they degrade?
Yes, I am.
And are you familiar with the conditions that will cause the chemical properties of blood to degrade or be preserved?
Yes, I am.
And is that part of your job, sir,
Yes.
and part of your training?
Yes, it is.
And in your experience and your opinion as an expert in this field, sir, will the chemical properties of blood be better preserved if the blood stain is dried than if it is in a wet pool?
Most of the chemicals that I deal with, they are much more stable dried than they are in a wet condition.
Objection. Move to strike. Non-responsive.
Overruled.
And the 1993 samples that you tested, sir, were those wet?
No, they were dry blood stains.
And were they what substrate? What were they on?
They were on cotton.
I have a graph, Your Honor, entitled EDTA Analysis, July 22nd, 1995, People's 552.
552.
Showing you People's 552, sir, can you tell us what you have depicted in this graph, in this chart?
Those were the blood samples, some of the ones that I ran on the 22nd.
Now, it shows on this chart you ran a blank.
That's correct.
And what does that mean?
Generally, between runs, you'll run a blank, just a solvent, to show that there's no carryover.
And in this case, does this graph depict that the blank was flat, no EDTA?
That's correct.
And then you have a 50 parts per millimeter, per million?
That's correct, yes.
And that, what was the purpose of running that?
Just to show that the instrument was working.
That it did detect a known standard of 50 parts per million?
Well, not necessarily 50 parts per million, but to show that it will detect EDTA and that it is fairly sensitive.
And then you have the 1993-1 and 1993-2. What do those show?
Those were the two blood stains that were preserved in the FBI laboratory since 1993 that were extracted. They were known EDTA blood standards, and they showed very high levels of EDTA.
Okay, now you come to the section that says RMM no. And what does that stand for?
That depicts my blood, which is not preserved with EDTA.
Now, is there some reading indicated on this? Is it a little bit higher than the blank?
Yes, there was some reading, and that was shown on the chromatograms we had seen earlier.
And that was where you said that there is some, you ran it for the daughter 160?
That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Fairlow. And could you show us now then the blank? And then the last column showing your blood thank you, showing your blood with EDTA added.
That's correct.
On this graph, sir, on this chart, can you tell us whether the results shown for your blood, where it says RMM no, where you have not added EDTA, and RMM yes, where you have added EDTA to your blood, bears any relationship or similarity to the comparison of the blood taken from the reference vials of the defendant and Nicole Brown and the evidence stains in this case from the gate and the sock?
Yes, there's a very clear comparison. My blood that was preserved and Mr. Simpson and Mrs. Simpson's bloods that were preserved all contained a large amount of EDTA. And my blood that was not preserved and the stain from the gate and the sock all showed indications of the 160 ion, but in none of those cases was I able to identify EDTA.
because of the lack of the full daughter spectrum.
That's correct.
Now, sir, in your job, is it unusual for you to discover new compounds, new chemicals?
I would say different, not necessarily new. They're chemicals that have existed, and it's the first time that we identify them.
Now, does the fact that you identify, would you say it's a routine thing to identify chemicals that you have not previously identified?
That's correct.
In that light, sir, in light of the fact that you routinely do identify new chemicals not previously identified, does that highlight the importance of refraining from identifying a compound until you see all of the characteristics that must be present, such as, in this case, the full daughter spectrum of 160 and 132, before you are ready to identify it as EDTA?
Yeah, it's very, very important. You don't want to jump to any conclusions because there are a lot of chemicals in the world. There's at least 11 million that are known, and I'm sure there's more. And a lot of those can have similar properties, and you must be very, very careful before you positively identify one of those chemicals.
And in doing so, in settling for, say, 2 out of the 3 factors, in this case, if you settle for the parent 293 and the daughter 160 without looking for the other daughter of 132, identifying EDTA when you see only 2 out of the 3 could cause a mistake to be made.
In my opinion, that could cause a mistake, yes.
Now, sir, when you were asked the question by us as to whether or not, when you were asked by the district attorney's office to look at the bloodstains in this case to determine whether or not EDTA was present, did anyone from our office tell you what test to conduct?
No, they did not.
Did you ever ask our permission before conducting any particular test?
I think I had called Rock up when I did the second test to make sure that I could use more sample, but that was the only time. When I initially conducted the test, I didn't ask for any permission from anybody, no.
And the reason that you contacted Mr. Harmon was to find out if you could get more of the sample so you could keep running tests.
That's correct.
You were not asking his permission as a scientist to allow you to perform a test that you felt was scientifically correct, were you?
No, I was not.
And if, in your judgment, sir, there were tests that you felt should be conducted and were scientifically appropriate to be conducted, would you await our permission before conducting that test?
No, I would not.
And if we asked you not to perform a test that you felt was scientifically proper and correct to do, would you accept that and not do it at our say-so?
Well, I mean, generally, I never really talk to the prosecutors. I just do the case. I work the case and give them the answer, is the way that I routinely do analysis.
And is that what you did in this case, sir?
Yes, it is.
And when you attempted to answer the question as to whether or not EDTA from a preserved tube was present in the evidence stains of the gate and the sock, did you conduct all of the tests that you in your judgment thought were scientifically appropriate to conduct?
Yes, I did.
And what answer did you obtain?
I was able to determine that the blood stains on the sock and the gate did not come from preserved blood.
Thank you, sir.
Blasier.
Sorry. May I mark the chart, Your Honor?
Yes. Mr. Blasier.
Thank you, Your Honor. Excuse me, Your Honor. I hadn't completed. If I may?
First, you need the mark.
These were from yesterday, Your Honor. I'd like
All right,
to...
Proceed. Oh, I'm sorry. I was directing my comment to Ms. Clark.
Oh, I'm sorry.
the charts that reflect, the graphs that reflect the runs for the evidence stains for the full daughter spectrum, 543E, which is a combination of 543A and C.
All right.
543F is the combination of the charts 543D and B. (544E) is a combination of the charts 544A and B. And 544F is a combination of the charts 544C and D.
Fine, thank you.
And may I conclude with one last question, Your Honor?
Proceed.
Never mind, Your Honor. I'm sure it'll become germane again. I'll conclude with this. Thank you.
Mr. Blasier.
Agent Martz, you testified yesterday that you had no bias one way or the other, either for the prosecution or for the defense. Do you remember that?
That's correct.
Is that your state of mind as you sit there today?
Yes.
Now, yesterday morning, recall my asking you questions and you answering the questions before the break?
Yes.
And you recall, after the break, you changed your demeanor, didn't you?
I think I did, yes.
And by the way, during Dr. Reeder's testimony, you were consulting with prosecutors throughout the course of that examination, were you not?
I think, yes, I was.
And you were providing them with possible questions or issues that they should raise?
Yes, I did.
And you were providing them with, Ms. Clark, with instruction as to what questions she might raise and what technological issues she might raise?
Well, like with them, with you, anything that you asked and they asked, I provided.
During each break, were you down there conferring with the prosecutors, in this case, while Dr. Reeders was testifying?
I don't know about each break. I did confer with them when they asked questions, yes.
And you were conferring with them during the course of my questioning of Dr. Reeders, correct?
When they asked questions, I answered them.
And during the break yesterday morning, did you meet with the prosecutors?
I stepped down and talked with them, yes.
Did you talk to them about your testimony?
Somewhat.
And you decided after the break that you needed to be much more of an advocate, didn't you?
No,
Sustain.
Did you decide at the break that you needed to be much more of an advocate?
no.
Did you decide that you had to be much more aggressive?
I think I decided that I had to be more truthful. I was not telling the whole truth with yes and no answers.
So you decided to change your demeanor.
Well, I decided that I wanted to tell the whole truth.
Now, you indicated that the only other time you've testified for the defense is in a case where 2 police officers were charged with murdering a civilian.
I won't say that's the only time. That's the time I remember. That's the only one I remember.
And during the course of your 17 years' experience with the FBI, you've never testified for the defense other than that and other than yesterday and today.
I don't remember any other time.
When I met with you in Washington about 2 weeks ago, did you have a conversation with the prosecutors after that meeting?
I'm sure I did.
Did you discuss the content of the meeting that we had?
I'm sure that I talked to them somewhat about it. I don't remember the specifics of what I told them.
Did
I
you-
can't, I can't even remember the specifics of what we talked about, you know, all the specifics. I did talk to them after our meeting.
And did you talk to them about some of the issues that you thought I was going to raise and how you might confront them?
I may have mentioned something, but I was confused. As I told you when you came to Washington, I didn't know why you were calling me to testify.
Now, can you tell me one time in your 17 years where after you talked to the prosecutors about a case that you worked on that you called the defense to talk to them and explain the issues to them?
Could you repeat that question?
Can you tell me one time in your 17 years experience when you've met with the prosecutors about a case that you followed that up by conferring with the defense to tell them what you discussed?
I've had occasions where I've talked to the defense after I've talked to the prosecution.
Do you make that a practice of letting the defense know when you've conferred with the prosecution about test results?
No.
Do you make it a practice to let defense attorneys know what issues they might want to raise with you or with other experts?
No.
Is there still your testimony that you have no prosecutorial bias here?
I have no bias whatsoever. Every question that you asked and they asked, I answered.
Now, you were asked a lot of questions about whether Dr. Reeders could have performed some of the tests that I was asking you about yesterday to validate what you might expect to lose by way of EDTA given environmental conditions. You remember that?
Yes, I do.
Is it your understanding, whose responsibility when you design a test like this, whose responsibility is it to validate it?
The test validates itself, basically. You run standards and controls. In chemical analysis, the instrumentation is all established. It's been validated. In a chemical analysis that we do in the laboratory, we identify unknown chemicals on a daily basis. And the instrumentation has all been established, and the identification of a chemical has been established based on its mass spectrum. And we routinely do that, and that's what I did in this case. The validation is just to show that the chemical you're looking for can be extracted. The identification is based on mass spectrum, which is well established. But in order to get it to the mass spectrum, you have to extract it. So what you have to do is show, by using a control, that you can extract that chemical and identify it.
Agent Martz, your validation, your self-validation, how long did that take?
Well, I think I can't remember what I testified to the other day, but I worked certainly more than a day and probably less than a week in developing a procedure that would extract the EDTA out of blood.
And that validation concerned just determining whether taking blood from an EDTA tube, putting it on a swatch, and then letting it dry for an hour and testing it, whether you could detect EDTA, correct?
That's correct.
You didn't do any validation study whatsoever to determine what samples preserved under the way these samples were preserved, collected, environmental factors. You did no validation study whatsoever to determine what, if any, loss you might have in EDTA, did you?
In this particular case, I didn't believe it was necessary. What I had was the best scenario. I had...
Objection, Your Honor. Move to strike. You didn't.
Question.
I'm sorry.
He's answered the question. Next question.
Now, when I met with you in Washington, I had requested your digital data, hadn't I?
Yes.
It had long since been destroyed, hadn't it?
Yes, it had.
Now, you mentioned yesterday you were talking about the 1954 study, and you felt that there were some problems with that.
That's correct.
One of the things you mentioned was that they found 30 parts per million EDTA in the bloodstream at some point.
That was my interpretation, yes.
Under what conditions did they find 30 parts per million EDTA in someone's bloodstream?
When they injected it into their, I think it was intermuscular and intravenous.
Injected directly into the blood.
That's, well, one of the times it was, yes.
How long did it take to work its way out of the system according to that study?
I can't remember specifically, but it was a short time period, I believe.
Do you have any reason to believe that Mr. Simpson or Ms. Nicole Brown Simpson had injected EDTA at any time on June 12th?
I would have no knowledge of that.
Now, you referred to that study for the purposes of explaining that they found 30 parts per million, correct?
That's my recollection. They found 30 parts per million, yes.
But you're not prepared to accept the fact that the study found that only 5% of EDTA taken by mouth gets into the blood.
I accept the fact that that's what they found in that study.
And you accept the fact that that's cited in a textbook that's used in virtually every medical school, that 5% of what you ingest gets into the blood.
Objection, that seems to pass evidence.
Forward.
Based on all the research that I did, all the latest literature refers back to the study in 1954, and that's where the 5% comes from. Yes.
You have no better literature other than that, do you?
That's the only literature that's available.
Do you have any, you don't have a degree in pharmacology, do you?
No, I do not.
Did you take any courses in your undergraduate in pharmacology?
Not specifically.
And your degree, is it in biology?
That's correct.
So you don't even have a degree in chemistry, do you?
Well, I have a minor.
Have you, do you have any kind of a degree in pharmacokinetics?
No, I do not.
You know what that is?
Oh, not specifically.
Do you know what pharmacodynamics is?
Not specifically.
When you read that particular study, did you have any, did you did you recognize it that it was a study in pharmacokinetics?
Well, I was looking at the paper because it was a study of EDTA. That was my interest in reviewing the paper.
Do you feel that you have the educational background to criticize that paper?
I didn't criticize the paper. The paper criticized itself, and I was just bringing that up.
That was your interpretation of the paper.
Well, the last paragraph said that there were some problems.
What did it say the problems were?
It wasn't consistent with previous studies.
Let me show you Defense 1268. That's the last page of that document that you're saying has contrary data to the absorption rate.
That's correct.
Can we look at this on the Elmo again? Tell me where in that paragraph it says that there's contrary information about absorption rates.
It says the low absorption after oral administration is very surprising in view of the finding that the material is effective by the, I'm having trouble, can you focus that? Oh, is that what it is?
Yttrium and lead?
Well, by the route of, I can't read it on this monitor.
Try again.
Is affected by the route in accelerating the excretion of yttrium and lead. There is no satisfactory, readily apparent explanation at this present.
Which part of that, I'm sorry, are you done?
Yes.
Which part of that says that there are different absorption rates?
Well, it says the low absorption after oral administration is very surprising because in another paper, they were able to remove yttrium and lead, and to remove that, you have to get into the bloodstream.
What did that other paper say about the absorption rate?
It didn't say.
But your interpretation of that document, that says there's a different absorption rate than 5%.
Well, it implies there's a different absorption rate because to effectively remove a chemical from the blood, you have to get into the blood.
Now, you indicated yesterday when Ms. Clark was asking you about possible explanations for what you found that's consistent with EDTA on the back gate and the sock, you mentioned an artifact due to the matrix effect. You remember that?
Right, correct.
Did you try to check that out?
Yes, I did, but,
Didn't pan out, did it?
well, I wasn't able to duplicate blood without being blood.
So you tried to check that hypothesis, and you weren't able to check it out, correct?
Well, in a time constraint, I didn't have sufficient time to check that out.
You told me, did you not, that you didn't think that was the explanation at all?
It's a possible explanation. We have several explanations, as I mentioned. That's a possible one.
You told me that you didn't think that one was likely at all, didn't you?
I don't think it's likely. I talked to some other experts that thought it was likely.
Mark, let me show you prosecution 544E. Incidentally, yesterday, in the morning before the break, you testified that what you saw on the back gate and on the sock was consistent with EDTA, correct?
No, I didn't say that. I said one of the charts had an ion that was consistent, or if I didn't, that's what I meant to say.
Well, you set up the experiment. This is the evidence from the back gate, is it not?
Right. There's an ion there. That's the same ion that you would get with EDTA.
And the parent ion is there, isn't it?
That's correct.
And the retention time is consistent, even though, as you stated, your chromatography was not particularly definitive.
That's correct.
Now, the exhibit that we have on the Elmo now is the gate chart, correct, with when you were looking for the 160 ion, right, at the bottom,
Yes.
compared to the full daughter spectrum above it, correct?
Yes.
Now, that's the same sample, isn't it,
Yes.
in those two runs?
Yes.
What happened to the 160 ion in the full daughter spectrum? Is it no longer there?
It didn't show up.
Is it no longer there?
It didn't show up in the daughter spectrum.
Did you change the sample in some fashion that would remove the 160 ion?
No.
So
No.
can you assume that it's still there in the full daughter?
No. As you mentioned with the camera and Dr. Readers, if you're looking at one specific ion, it's easier to see. But if you're doing a full scan, you may not see all those ions. But for me to identify a chemical, they have to be present.
Are you saying that the 160 is not present in the full daughter spectrum of the same sample?
That's correct.
That it's not there because you can't see it on the chart?
That's correct.
So it's your testimony that if you can't see the ion, it can't be there.
I can't identify it if I can't see it.
Can it be there and you're just not seeing it?
Sure, you can always be below your detection limit.
And if you had really been looking for the 132 ion, you could have done the same kind of scan that you did for the 160, couldn't you have?
To look, yeah, sure, yes.
Did you?
No.
You didn't want to find the 132 ion, did you?
No, it wasn't that I didn't want to find the 132 ion. I needed a full daughter spectrum. In finding the 132 ion, it would be just like finding the 160 ion by itself. It would be a screening test. In order to confirm, I need all the ions together in a certain ratio.
You said yesterday that you would have loved to have had an internal standard, correct?
I would have liked it. I don't know about love, but I would have liked to have an internal standard,
You
yes.
told me in Washington you would have loved to have had
Well,
one, didn't you?
Yes, one or the other.
And that would have made your test from a non-quantitative test to at least some measure of quantitation, correct?
I believe I do have some level of quantitation already.
Agent Martz? You testified that this was not designed to be a quantitative test, didn't you?
It wasn't, but that doesn't mean that you can't use it to quantitate,
What's the purpose of using an internal standard?
to get precise quantitation.
Now, you're aware now, aren't you, that there is an internal standard that's commercially available that you could have used?
Well, you showed me a book yesterday. I still haven't called the manufacturer to confirm that it's available, but did you do that? Is it available?
Did you look at the chemical description of what was in the book?
I looked at it very close, or I didn't look at it very closely, but I saw something that you showed me that you said was EDTA.
And would you like to look at it again?
If I could.
Martz, let me show you, perhaps we could have a copy of this page, and as well as the cover, marked as the next exhibit, 1270.
1270.
I'm sorry, 1270?
Yes, what's the title of the booklet?
Cambridge Isotope Laboratories,
All right,
Stable Isotopes, 1994-1995.
thank you.
Agent Martz, let me show you from the bottom of page 49 of that catalog. Does that appear to be an internal standard available that you could have used with your testing?
Yes, it does.
How much does it cost?
Oh, $690.
How much would you have needed to use?
Oh, generally to weigh something you would like, at least 10 milligrams.
10 milligrams?
Yes.
How much did $690 buy?
Was it a gram? I can't remember. Gram. Yeah, I could have bought the smaller standard, yes.
And what did the smaller standard cost?
I can't remember what it... $115.
All right, Mrs. Robertson, would you have Mr. Lee make a copy for us, please? Mr. Blasier.
Now, you were shown quite a few charts by the prosecution, the red bar charts, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Mrs. Robertson. You're looking for 552?
Any one of the red charts. Let me show you 552. Agent Martz, you prepared this as well as several other charts in an attempt to compare quantities by ion count, did you not?
It was prepared to show the dramatic difference between preserved and non-preserved blood.
To compare ion counts between one sample and another, correct?
I used ion counts for the comparison, yes.
Now, you've indicated that your ion counts can fluctuate because of the vagaries of the instrument by fourfold, can't they?
They did over the period of that one day, yes.
So you could adjust those, either you could make them 4 times bigger or 4 times smaller, and that would still be within the realm of the tolerance of your machine. Fair enough?
Well, that's a big variance. You generally don't get that large, but I would agree that that day it was fourfold.
Okay. Your Honor, may we approach about an exhibit?
Sure. With the court reporter, please. proceed.
Agent Martz, you were asked some questions yesterday by Ms. Clark regarding why you don't belong to any professional societies that specialize in mass spectrometry, other than the one that you mentioned. Remember that?
Yes.
And the one that you mentioned doesn't specialize in mass spec, does it?
No, and I think I said that.
And I believe your answer or your response to Ms. Clark's suggestion was that you can keep up with current trends just by talking to your peers. Is that right?
Well, I think I can do it in more ways than that. I have 20 people that work for me, and some of them are very highly educated. I have 4 PhDs presently working for me. They're out attending a lot of meetings, presenting papers. We have a staff at Quantico, a lot of PhDs that do a lot of research, and we keep in contact with them. We're constantly bringing people into the FBI Academy for training. The FBI is constantly sending people outside to give speeches, lectures, talk, papers. Some of the organizations that were mentioned that I don't belong to, I've attended some of their meetings. I've co-authored papers that were presented at those meetings. So with the staff that I have, it's very easy to keep up because we have 20 people that are very aggressively do forensic science.
Agent Martz, does the FBI prohibit you from joining professional organizations in your specialty?
No, they don't.
So you could if you wanted to.
I am a member of one, and like I said, a lot of the people in the unit are members of other ones, yes.
Now, the papers that you say you published, that's the 4 that you mentioned yesterday over 17 years?
Well, there's 4 there, and then I have 2 papers that are being published right now.
Now, does the FBI require that you even have an undergraduate degree in chemistry or toxicology to become a chemist and toxicologist?
To work in the chemistry unit, you have to have a certain number of chemistry hours that are required. I met that specification. I had extensive training in chemistry in college.
Is the answer to that no, that the FBI doesn't require that you have a degree in it?
Yes, either chemistry, toxicology, or equivalent,
Which includes biology?
which includes a certain number of hours in chemistry.
Now, yesterday I asked you some questions about the blood test that you ran on your own blood.
That's
Remember
correct.
that?
Yes.
And I made some suggestions about the possibility that maybe the EDTA or the EDTA-like substance that appears in your blood may have come from the tube itself. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Had you thought of that when you did that little experiment?
No, I did not.
Think it's a reasonable point to consider?
No, not really.
But you didn't think of it at all, did you?
No.
When you got the stain from the back gate, you never inquired at all what conditions under which that stain might have been subjected to either before it was collected or after, correct?
I think the only question that I had is whether or not DNA was identified, because in my opinion, if DNA was present, the EDTA would still be present.
So you asked no questions at all about the conditions under which that stain got there and may have been subjected to prior to collection.
Only that it was identified as blood and had DNA present.
So you didn't consider the question as to whether the effect of the environment might have any effect at all, did you?
In my opinion, EDTA is a very stable chemical, and when dried in a blood stain, the environment would not affect it.
You didn't consider that question at all when you designed this test, did you?
No, as I mentioned, EDTA is a very stable chemical, and in dried condition, in my opinion, it will not break down in that short a time.
I'm sorry.
In that short time period.
Is there any study that you're aware of on dried blood stains and whether or not the EDTA degrades with weathering?
No, but I contacted the manufacturer that makes preserved blood tubes of EDTA, and the shelf life of the tubes when it's in solution is 18 to 24 months.
Move to strike, non-responsive.
Sustain.
You aware of any study that anyone has ever done on blood stains, dried blood stains that have been subjected to environmental influences in terms of whether or not that diminishes the amount of EDTA that you can recover?
No.
Do you know of any scientific literature that's relevant at all to that question?
Probably the most relevant is the testing that I've done myself on some old blood stains from 1993 and one from 1991.
That's the test you never wrote a report on, correct?
That's correct.
Did the prosecution tell you in this case that you're supposed to write a report when you do testing?
In the laboratory, when a case is submitted, we will perform or supply a report. When we do research, we generally don't supply a report.
Move to strikes, non-responsive. Were you instructed that if you did testing related to a case, that you're supposed to write it up as a report?
No.
It's your practice then, when you do a test on something, even though it's related to a case, you don't feel the necessity to even take notes?
It would depend on the circumstances. If it's something that I can remember readily, no, I wouldn't.
So that the criterion you use as to whether you can remember it down the road, as to whether you write anything down.
Yes, I mean, if I can remember what I did, I won't write it down.
Agent Marsh, do you think it would make any difference on your ability to recover EDTA if the stain from the back gate was placed in a wet condition in a plastic bag?
It would depend on, was it in solution or just damp?
Did you ever ask that question?
No.
It's an important question, isn't it?
I don't believe that it is. I believe EDTA is stable, even in those conditions in that short time period.
So these assumptions that you're making, that nothing's going to happen to the EDTA on the sock or the back gate, given the conditions under which they were put there, collected, stored, handled, since EDTA is stable, that ends the inquiry as far as you're concerned. You don't need to do any specific testing on that question at all?
Well, I did test the blood, which is in solution, the known blood sample. That's the best control in the world.
How long did, I'm sorry.
EDTA is more stable, in my opinion, as a stain than it is in solution, and it survived in the blood sample, the known sample that I tested.
Now, which sample is this?
The K67 and K68.
How long did you let those stains dry?
As I mentioned, EDTA is more stable.
Move to strike, non-responsive.
Sustained.
How long did you let the reference blood that you put on your controls dry?
Approximately an hour.
How soon after that did you test it?
It was fairly soon, the first
hour?
time.
I'm sorry?
Yes, that would be.
Did you ever make any inquiry with respect to the sock as to how many times it had been handled by various experts, criminalists, etc.?
No, I did not.
Did you make any inquiry whatsoever to determine what kinds of light, ultraviolet, infrared, regular light, it had been subjected to before you got it?
No, in my opinion, it wasn't necessary.
Do you have any studies to back up the notion that, or your opinion, that light, different kinds of light sources is not going to have any effect on EDTA?
Objection, ask and answer.
The studies that I performed,
Any studies that anybody else has ever performed?
there's studies that show that it passes through the body unchanged, and that's a very hostile environment.
What does that have to do with light? Are you saying, let me ask you this, I'll withdraw that. Are you saying that because it passes through the body, that's enough for you to conclude that different kinds of light on it is not going to have any effect on it?
No, no.
Now, you said that by your own experiment you determined that. What experiment did you do to test the effects of different kinds of light on dried blood stains with EDTA in them?
I didn't do any specifically.
You were aware, were you not, that the sock had gone through infrared light? Or did you know that?
I think I knew that because an infrared photograph had been taken.
Agent Marsh, did you do any experiments to determine whether you could, as efficiently, remove EDTA blood from metal as you could from a swatch?
The only testing that were done per se was the gate, which was, that wouldn't count, but the can, I used one metal surface. That was the only one that I had done.
Now, you did 2 positive controls for the gate, did you not? The can
Right, yes.
and a swatch, correct?
That's correct.
And that was a swatch, a control swatch that presumably had been taken from the gate, near but not part of the blood stain. Is that what your understanding was?
Well, I had prepared my own control swab because that one wasn't large enough. I'd mentioned that yesterday, I believe.
So your control that you used for the gate, you didn't even use the swatch that they sent you? That was their control swatch?
No, we had mentioned that yesterday.
So you used a swatch that, and you don't know whether it was the same kind of material, the same thickness, do you?
No. I answered that yesterday, no.
So you only ran 2 times. You ran that control that you just told us about that you made on your material and the can to see how much, what your ion count would be, how much EDTA you got out, correct?
For the for the gate?
Gate.
That's correct, yes.
You know, I'd like to have a slide presentation marked next. 1271. We have A. Agent Martz, it's 1271A on the screen. Could you take a look at that? Well, let me ask you this. Does that represent chart 4085, the control that you just talked about where you used your own fabric?
Yes,
And 4043 is the one you did on the can, right?
that's correct.
And those are 2 different days, right?
Correct.
And what was your ion count for the control on the cloth?
A little over 8 million,
And what was your ion count on the control you did on the can?
a little over 3 million.
And there's approximately a 3-fold difference in those 2, correct?
That's correct.
Isn't it accurate that one possible explanation for that is that you can't remove EDTA as efficiently from metal as you can from cloth?
Could I give my explanation for it?
No, I'll let you give that one next. Is that one reasonable explanation that I gave you?
I don't believe that that's a reasonable explanation, no.
Did you test that hypothesis at all?
No?
Now, your explanation is what? That it's the variation in the machine?
Well, it's variation over the day, and as I mentioned, when I do a control, whenever I perform this experiment, we're cutting a piece of a fabric, okay? I don't know, or on that day, the size that I cut, the control is going to be the same size as the known, or the Q and the known are going to be the same size. On a different day, I may cut something a little larger, a little smaller. I didn't have a particular instrument or a scale to weigh the exact size that I took. So what I took was relative sizes. And the size the one day could have been larger than the size the other day, plus the instrumental conditions. Those would be my explanation as to the difference in the ion count.
Agent Marsh, did you write down in your work papers that you used different sizes in different tests?
No.
Why didn't you write that down? If you changed the conditions from one test to the next, why didn't you write that down?
As I mentioned, I didn't change the conditions comparing the K to the Q, and that's what was relevant here, to determine whether or not the stains came from preserved or non-preserved blood. So I prepared those the same each time.
You wrote down, when you did your first test on February 22nd, the sizes of the samples that you used, the size of the swatches, and you wrote down that information, didn't you?
Well, I said approximate.
But you didn't write anything down for February 28th showing that you had changed the conditions using different sizes.
Well, I mean, it would be impossible for me to cut the exact same size stain. I didn't see any reason to write that down.
Now, does that fall in the category of something that you remembered you changed it, so you didn't need to write it down?
Well, I think it's obvious that I can't cut the exact same size of stain, and I mentioned that earlier, and that's why I always cut a larger amount of the question stain than I did the known. Now, when I'm cutting them right in front of me, the same time, I can see that. Now, 5 days later, 10 days later, when I'm cutting, I don't have those in front of me anymore. I'm approximating the size that I'm cutting.
So you might have actually cut a bigger swatch when you did the can experiment on the 28th than you had for the positive control on the 22nd. Is that what
Based
you're
on my
saying?
results, I would say no.
So you're using your results to bootstrap and find and say that you must have used a smaller sample because of the results.
To me, it's immaterial as long as I use the same size each day.
It couldn't be the result of you not being able to remove EDTA from metal as efficiently as you can from a swatch.
Not in my opinion. That would not be the possibility.
Can we have slide B, please? Now, Agent Martz, on the 28th, you tested the gate, the evidence, the bloodstain evidence from the gate, did you not?
Yes.
And this is the same positive control. This is your can experiment, correct?
Yes.
And you did those very close together, didn't you? In time.
Yes.
And your ion count for the can was about 3 million?
That's correct.
And what was your ion count for the evidence?
Approximately 200,000. Was it 220,000? 221,000? Yes.
Now, you didn't make a chart that showed those experiments on the 28th for the prosecution, did you?
I don't believe I did, no.
That doesn't look like a 1,000-fold difference, does it?
No.
Now, Agent Martz, would you agree that all of these charts that you made for the prosecution have as their basis an underlying assumption that you're using the same amount of blood from the evidence as you are using in the control?
Well, I tried to approximate it, but you got to remember here that I'm taking blood off of a surface, and I don't specifically remembered how much I took off.
Wouldn't it be very misleading to put two figures on a chart when they're based on different starting amounts?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, when I cut a stain, it's very easy. You can see it. But when I took a stain off of a can, I removed it with a cotton swatch.
Move to
And-
strike. I'm sorry. Move to strike. Non-responsive.
Answer stricken.
Wouldn't it be very misleading to put together a chart when you're starting, when you have different starting amounts for the components of that chart?
I don't believe so.
Now, you've testified that your ion counts can fluctuate by as much as 4 times because of the machinery, correct?
I testify they fluctuated that amount on the one particular day.
And I want you to assume hypothetically for just a moment that, well, let me ask you this. What's your assumption in terms of how much blood you used for the evidence sample on February 28th for the gate?
It was larger than the minimum amount that I required, which is the 1 millimeter squared.
How much larger?
It was probably approximately probably 1.5 by 1.5.
Which is how many square millimeters?
Well, 1.5 square millimeter.
1.5 squared?
Right.
And you had determined that the minimum size swatch that you needed to use to get a detectable amount was 1 square millimeter?
Well, that was based on negative ion, so for positive ion, I would need 1/10 of that. So it would be a very, very small.
You calculated what size swatch you needed for these tests to have a minimum detectable amount of EDTA blood, did you not?
For negative ion, yes.
And you didn't do any different calculation for positive ion, did you?
No, but based on the fact that the positive ion is 10 times stronger, or 10 times, has 10 times the ability to detect it, then I would need 1/10 the size stain.
I want you to assume for purposes of a hypothetical that your estimate of the quantity of the blood that you used from the blood stain was only 1/4 of what you thought it was. Do you have that in mind?
Yes.
And obviously, if you used much less blood, you would expect a lower ion count, wouldn't you?
That's correct.
Now, could we have chart C, please?
She had objections on this. It's 2 different days that are reflected, misleading.
Agent Martz, this is the same day, isn't it, the 28th? These two tests, aren't they?
Well, that's what's labeled, yes.
Now, would you agree that if you
Objection assumes facts, not evidence. May the witness be shown the underlying graphs, Your Honor?
you feel the need to check your data, Agent Martz?
Are these the areas or the peak heights
Areas.
areas? And what's the first sample, the gate one?
The gate and your can.
Okay.
If you had overestimated the amount of blood from the evidence that you started with it by 4, then it would not be unreasonable to assume that your ion count should be 4 times higher to make the same, to equate the amounts together. Correct?
Can I look at my data?
Sure. This is the same sample from the earlier chart where you got.
Now, the one you've got labeled positive control 4043, you said that was my area?
That was your can. No, this is your can reduced. Well, okay, I haven't finished the whole chart, so let's talk about the gate first.
Okay.
You got an ion count of 210,000, correct? Remember from the earlier chart?
Now, when you refer to 4049,
Yes.
I have a different chart labeled 4049.
Well, you had okay, what's your ion count on 4049?
200,000.
Okay, and that's the one we were just talking about from the last chart, correct?
Okay.
Now, my hypothetical is that you've overestimated the amount of blood by a factor of 4.
So this is not my data?
This is 4 times your data to adjust for the quantities.
Now, I don't understand what you're trying.
Well, okay, let me ask it this way. If you got 210,000 ion count from a half a microliter of blood, would it be reasonable to assume that you might get in the range of 800,000 from 2 microliters of blood?
No, because we had mentioned once before this could be a matrix effect. We don't know what that is or where it's from. You can't assume that.
You can't assume that if you used 4 times more blood from the evidence that you'd get 4 times higher ion count?
No.
How much more would you get?
It depends on what this compound is and the source of it. I told you I don't know what it is and I don't know the source.
All right, let's assume hypothetically that 4 times as much blood is going to give you 4 times as much EDTA. Can we assume that, if it's EDTA blood to start with?
Yes.
And the range of your measurement ability on your positive controls as well as the gate, you could have a 4-fold difference in ion count. Now, if you got an ion count of 8 million, or I'm sorry, 3 million on that control, correct?
Yes.
1/4 of that is 750,000, isn't it?
Yes.
So under that assumption of those different conditions which are within the realm of your experimental basis, you might get, it appears that you get the same quantity in terms of ion count from the evidence as you got from the known EDTA blood, doesn't it?
No, I would disagree with that.
Are my numbers wrong?
Well, you're taking both numbers and moving them 4 times. You can't do that. That's a factor of 8 then.
Well, I'm moving the gate 4 times based on quantity, not on the machine, the variance of the machine.
Well, I don't see how you can do that.
Okay. Now, did you take the same amount of care with everything that you did in your experiments? I mean, did you try to be as careful as possible with everything you did?
Yes.
Here, this be a good time.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our mid-afternoon recess at this time. Remember, all my admonitions to you will be in recess for about 15 minutes. All right, Agent March, you can step down. You're ordered to come back in 15. Thank you.
But Dad, it's too late to change the label, so I penciled it in.
That was a mistake, wasn't it?
I don't know if I'd call it a mistake. It just wasn't paying attention. I guess you could call it a mistake.
Did you check the sample afterwards to make sure that you had labeled it properly when you changed the labeling?
Well, I knew that's the sample that I had run. I just didn't label it properly.
You knew at the time that you hadn't labeled it properly?
After the run, I did.
And you knew after the run because you just looked at the chart.
No, that's not true at all.
How'd you figure it out?
Because I knew which sample I ran. I told you, you label the chart. I changed the run number. You have to change the run number. It doesn't automatically change the sample. You have to change that also. In this case, I didn't change the sample.
What was the time difference between that run and the one right before it?
3 minutes.
And you change the label each 3 minutes as they're going through the system?
Yes. There's a lot to do in that 3 minutes, and I made a mistake in that 3-minute time period.
Now, yesterday you were asked questions about the dress. Do you remember that?
Yes,
And you said that you detected EDTA on the dress.
that's correct.
And the difference between the EDTA or the EDTA-like substance on the dress and the evidence was the presence of the 132 ion, correct?
Well, I got the full daughter spectrum, yes. The 132 ion is part of the full daughter.
And you indicated, I believe, yesterday that you would not identify the 132 daughter ion unless its signal was 3 times higher than the noise. Remember that?
I said that's what people like to look for, 3 times the noise for identification of a signal, yes.
May I mark another chart?
Yes, defense 1273. And what is this, Mr. Blasier?
This is a chart labeled control for dress, for K65 dress.
Thank you. Mrs. Robertson, 1273? All right, thank you.
Agent Martz, let me show you 1273 and ask if that's the full daughter spectrum, or the full spectrum for the control for the dress.
Yes, that is.
Can you show this on the Elmo, please?
You may.
Agent Martz, you see numerous spikes. Let me cover up the top part to illustrate that. In the bottom area, going all the way along the bottom axis.
Yes.
Is that noise?
Yes.
Now let's look at the 132 ion. It's not much higher than the noise, is it?
No, it's not.
So your standard of 3 times, you didn't apply it here.
Well, if you remember in my report, I said it was detected. I did not identify the EDTA in this sample, and that's why I said it was detected and not identified. I used that because I wasn't comfortable identifying it to the exclusion of all other chemicals, but I thought I had enough there to say it was detected.
You've testified here that you think that's EDTA, correct?
I believe that it probably is.
And the reason that you will not say that the evidence is EDTA is because you couldn't identify the daughter spectrum, right?
Yes.
All right, let's compare this to the full spectrum that you did on the gate stain. Do you have that chart with you? The chart that corresponds to this chart that's on the screen.
I don't have the one that corresponds to that because there was no spectrum to print out.
Let's look at the one for the sock that corresponds to this chart for the dress.
I don't have that one also because there was no spectrum to print out.
So you didn't print out any results at all like you did for the dress.
No, there was nothing to print out.
So, and that data's been destroyed, hasn't it?
Yes.
So we cannot look at your chart that you did on the back gate and the sock to see whether the 132 iron is really there, can we?
Yes, you can look at the RICs that I provided.
With a chart like this is the full spectrum, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
We don't have a chart like this for the gate or the sock, do we? Because you destroyed the data and you never printed out the report.
I looked at the chromatogram, and it did not show EDTA present, and I didn't print it out. There was nothing to print out. It was all noise.
But you have nothing to show us that demonstrates that.
Yes, I do. I have the RIC chromatogram, which shows that there is no signal.
Well, that's the one that shows that the 160 disappeared also, isn't
Well,
it?
I mean, if you look back, I probably have the RIC for the dress. Let's see if I have it.
You don't want to admit that there's EDTA on the back gate and the sock because it hurts the prosecution, do you?
No.
The question and answer stricken juries to disregard his argument.
Now, Agent Martz, you've testified that your basis for estimating the quantity of blood in the evidence that you started with was looking at it, correct?
Yes.
You did no analytical method whatsoever to try and quantify the amount of blood that you started with in the evidence.
I believe I answered this question yesterday, and I'll give the same answer. I looked at the stain. It was consistent with blood undiluted. I cut out the stain, and then I extracted with water. I looked at the water extract. They had similar colors, and I also did a presumptive test, phenolphthalein, which gave similar responses.
You didn't use any analytical tests that are designed to determine quantity other than looking at it, did you?
I believe I just answered that question.
Okay. Now, you made an estimate of, now incidentally, have you ever tested your ability to measure quantities of blood by looking at it?
I think I did in this particular case. I mean, if you look at my controls that I ran on the samples, I got fairly similar results.
Have you ever done a blind study where you don't know how much blood is there and you're tested on your ability to recognize and quantify blood by just looking at it?
No.
Is there any textbook, any chemistry textbook that you have ever looked at or seen that recommends as a valid way of quantifying something for analytical purposes to just look at it?
Oh, I don't know specifically if there is or not, no.
Now, one of the calculations that you made here had to do with what's the biggest swatch we need to detect EDTA blood. Let's assume EDTA blood's on it, and what's the biggest swatch we need to detect it, right?
That's correct.
And it'd be very unfair if you ran a sample of the evidence stains that was around or smaller than what you knew to be the minimum detectable amount, right?
Yes.
Now, I'd like to use the chart, the paper chart back there. Agent Martz, you can step down if you like. Is this ready to see?
The problem is juror number 7, I don't think can see that because of the angle. And 165 may not be able to see it because of the height. You can see it? All right, thank you, sir. Mr. Blasier.
Now, Agent Martz, you determined the minimum size of a swatch that you needed to use to detect blood with EDTA in it as 1 square millimeter, correct?
That's based on negative ion results.
Okay. And tell us how you arrived at that calculation.
I took cuttings of different sizes of swatches, and I was able to draw a graph and calculate that would be the minimum size needed.
Well, you made us, you put 10 microliters of blood on some cloth material, did you not?
Yes.
And you measured the diameter, I'm sorry, the radius, or the diameter of that, did you not?
That's correct.
And could you draw, not to scale obviously, a circle that represents the 10 microliters of blood that you
Okay.
did to determine your minimum detectable amount?
Right.
And that's 10 microliters of blood. You want to write 10 microliters of blood?
I think it was probably 5, wasn't it? Is what I used.
Well, you want to look at your notes?
Well, I think for cutting this out, I did 5 microliters.
Well, I want you to be accurate. Look at your notes. You're right. I think you're right.
Okay.
5 microliters. And you found that 5 microliters of blood gave you a spot that was how big?
Well, I had pictures of it. I can't remember.
You want to look at your notes?
Is it in there?
What was the diameter?
About 5 millimeters.
Okay. You want to draw a line that represents the diameter and write 5 millimeters. Okay, now below that, I want you to draw a little square that represents a swatch. Way below it. There you go. Thank you. And, well, we wanted a square one. You determined that you needed a square 1 millimeter on each side,
Oh,
right?
Okay.
Now, and you had previously determined by other tests that you needed not only a swatch 1 millimeter on a side, but 0.5 microliters of blood is the minimum detectable blood, correct?
Based on negative ion. On positive ion, it would be 1/10 of that.
Now put a 0.5 microliters down by the swatch. So is it accurate that you calculated that you needed a swatch 1/2 the size, I'm sorry, 1/10 of the size of your 5 microliter circle to get a big enough swatch to have a minimum detectable amount of EDTA?
Based on negative ion.
Okay, but that's the ratio we're talking about, correct?
No, we were talking about positive ion there. It
No,
would
no.
be 1/10.
Now, in terms of 5 microliters, 0.5, there's a 10-fold difference.
Right.
So the area of your circle should be 10 times bigger than your swatch, right?
Right.
Can you calculate the area of a circle with a 5 millimeter diameter?
I mean, I could. I don't. Math. I don't know right now what it is.
Well, what's
Another
the formula for the area of a circle?
Is it pi r squared?
And what's pi?
Well, you're really testing me. 2.12? 2.17? I don't know.
How about 3.1214?
Is that what?
Isn't pi kind of essential to being a scientist, knowing what it is?
I haven't used pi since I was in, I guess, high school. I don't know.
Let's try 3.14,
Is that what it is? 3.14?
what it is.
There's an easier way to do this.
Let's try 3.14, and what's the radius?
So it'd be half the diameter. 2.5.
Okay, 2.5. Squared, right?
Right.
Your Honor, may we borrow a calculator? Can you use a calculator?
Yes. I think.
Tell me what pi times 2.5 squared is. I'll write down 19. Square millimeters, right? It's the area. What's 1/10 of that?
1.9.
You miscalculated by a factor of 2 the minimum size of a swatch you needed to detect EDTA, didn't you?
I don't know that I did or not. I calculated a little differently. I didn't use this.
Well, does the area change by the different methods of calculation?
Well, this is all estimations based on my eyeball. I didn't use any scientific math to determine it. What I did was I took the circle and I divided it in half. And then I divided it in half again in a quarter. And I just cut out a piece. and that's how I did it.
So when you say in your report that you determined that you needed a square 1 millimeter,
I said approximately. This is all approximate.
would you agree that under the conditions that you set forth in your report, that 1/10 of a circle of 5 microliters of blood is a swatch 2 square millimeters, not 1?
Approximately right. As I mentioned before, though, in the positive ion mode, it really doesn't make any difference because it would be 1/10 that.
Were you trying to be careful in the quantifications that you used?
I told you what I did, and I took small portions of it and used that to calculate how much my minimum detectable limit was.
We take a stand. Did you just say that you did this in a way that wasn't very scientific?
Well, I don't know if your definition of scientific is, but I took a circle and divided it into pieces and cut a piece out.
Not very scientific, is it?
Well, in this particular case, we got to go back to the original focus. Can we distinguish between preserved and non-preserved blood? We're talking 1,000-fold difference. Any imprecision that I may have had here will not affect my results.
Could we have chart B? This is, I don't remember the number. 1271B, you remember that chart, Agent Martz?
Yes.
That looked like 1,000-fold difference. These are your measurements, aren't they?
Well, you've got to remember with a mass
Agent move to strike.
No, he can answer the question. Ask
That-
him the question.
Does that appear to be 1,000-fold difference to you from your own data?
in that particular thing,
Yeah.
no.
Now, Agent Martz, I'd like to ask you some questions about your ability to determine quantities of blood by looking at, okay?
Okay.
You provided me with some pictures of different spots of blood, did you not?
Yes, I did.
Sidebar with court order, please.
what size blood drop you would get with various quantities of blood?
I did put a couple different size drops on paper to see how big they were, yes.
And one of your methods that you used to estimate how much blood you had from the evidence was to look at those blood drops, correct?
No, I used that, basically put them on paper so I would know how much sample to take, and I measured a certain amount out, so I knew how large the area was.
Does the same amount of blood put on different substrates look different in terms of the quantity, size of the drops?
Yes.
How much different?
Oh, it would depend, maybe 20, 30%. I don't know specifically. I certainly didn't do any calculations.
You didn't do any testing of that at all, did you?
No.
Did you prepare some samples with blood drops to compare? Okay, you indicated you did one set of blood drops on different substrates.
I believe I did something on filter paper and one on a cloth. I think it was a towel.
Okay. Did you do a second sample of blood drops on the same kind of material as the towel?
I don't understand.
Your dilution experiment. Remember that? That you talked to me about?
Overruled.
I don't think I did that dilution experiment.
What was the material used for that dilution experiment?
I didn't do that experiment.
So the size of a blood drop, or your testimony is it can only vary by 20%?
No, I'm not saying that. I don't know. I didn't measure. I gave you an approximation.
So you don't know how much the size of a blood drop will change given different substrates?
No, and that's why, you know, in this particular case, when I did the sock, I made sure I used the sock as a control. And the gate was swabbed with a cotton swab or cotton swatch, so I used a cotton swatch. I used similar material.
You didn't use, how do you know you used the same kind of swatch? You didn't look at them, did you?
Well, they were the type that are used for serology and DNA, and I got mine from the DNA unit.
In your opinion, can the size of a blood drop with a given quantity of blood vary by 8 times, depending on the substrate?
I've never observed that, is all I can say.
Your Honor?
Proceed. He indicated he didn't do that dilution.
Did you examine the photographs that you provided to me of blood spots?
I looked at them.
Did you examine the sizes of blood spots that you had in your photographs to determine whether or not, what the difference might be with different substrates with the same amount of blood?
We're back to the ones that I prepared?
Yeah, did you ever compare those to the dilution ones that were prepared for you?
No.
I'd like to refresh his memory with these.
He's never seen them. How can you refresh your memory?
He said he's provided them. I assume he's seen them. It's for the purpose of refreshing recollection. It's also a speaking objection. Have a seat.
Agent Martz, I'd like you to review those photographs.
I'd like to make a correction. This is something I did prepare here. I thought you were referring to the other one.
No. So you prepared both of those photographs?
Yes, I did.
You prepared the stains that are contained in the photographs?
Yes.
Now, may I have them marked?
Yes.
Two photographs.
1274 and 5.
1274 and 5?
Yes.
Agent Martz, when you prepared these, did you measure out the quantities of blood that you put on them?
Can I see those again?
Sure.
I know that I did in this one, and I can't.
Which one is that?
Oh.
What's the one number on that?
1274 those are all labeled 5 microliters, so I know that that's what I did. In this other one, 1275, I don't remember what I did.
Do you remember me showing you that picture about hour and a half ago and asking you how much blood you used for that second picture?
Yes.
You told me 10 microliters, didn't you?
I can't remember if that's what I said. I probably said 5 I don't know if I said 10, 5. I don't know what it is.
Did you tell me 10?
I can't remember. I can't remember.
All right, I'd like to show these.
1274 you can show. 1275, the objection sustained.
Let me ask you a foundational question. 1275, the second picture, was that the same substrate as the first?
I can't remember.
When you did the experiment, this dilution experiment, did you write down any of the conditions of your experiment?
No, I did not.
Is that because you could